A cop pulls over an elderly black woman. Minutes later, his hands shake, his face turns pale, and he's begging for forgiveness. Why? Because he just made the biggest mistake of his life. What started as a simple traffic stop turned into something shocking. One decision exposed his deepest bias, and when he realized who she was, everything changed. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe this twist. Let's get into it. So here's what happened next. Officer Jake Reynolds had just pulled over the car. He stepped out, adjusting his belt, feeling like he was just doing his job. A broken taillight, routine stuff. But inside that car, Eleanor Carter, an elderly black woman in her 70s, sitting there quietly, gripping the steering wheel. She had done nothing wrong, yet her heart pounded. She had seen this play out before. She knew how quickly things could go wrong. Reynolds approached the window. License and registration. His voice was firm, no nonsense. Eleanor fumbled with her purse, her hands slightly trembling. "Yes, officer," she said politely, handing over her ID. But Reynolds wasn't just looking at the card. He was watching her. Why did she look nervous? Why was she shaking? That was enough to set off alarms in his head. His mind went straight to suspicion. Drugs? Stolen car? Fake ID? Something wasn't right. He could feel it. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he said, his tone sharper now. Eleanor looked up, confused. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Reynolds said. "Step out of the car, now." And just like that, the situation took a turn she had feared all along. Eleanor Carter stood still, her hands lightly trembling. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. Yet here she was, standing on the side of the road, ordered out of her own car like she was some kind of criminal. She had seen this before. The stares, the assumptions, the doubt in the officer's eyes. She had lived through this her entire life. "Step to the front of the car," Jake Reynolds ordered, his voice clipped, sharp. Eleanor exhaled slowly. No sudden movements, no backtalk. Stay calm, stay respectful, stay safe. That's what she had always been told. She walked to the front, placing her hands on the hood as instructed. "Officer, I don't understand what this is about," she said, keeping her voice steady. Reynolds ignored her, stepping back to glance inside her car. His eyes scanned the back seat. A bag of groceries, a Bible, a folded-up sweater. Nothing suspicious. Still, he wasn't convinced. "You're acting nervous," he said. Eleanor blinked. "I'm an elderly woman being ordered out of my car for no reason. Wouldn't you be nervous?" Reynolds smirked slightly, shaking his head. "People don't get this nervous unless they have something to hide." Eleanor sighed, looking down at her hands. This was ridiculous. "I have nothing to hide," she said simply. Reynolds didn't believe her. "You mind if I take a look inside?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had been through this before. She knew her rights. She knew this was wrong. "Officer, I respect the work you do," she said, "but you don't have probable cause to search my car." And just like that, Reynolds's expression changed. There it was, defiance. He had seen this before. People trying to play smart, trying to challenge his authority. But he wasn't going to let her win. "You know a lot about the law," he muttered, folding his arms. Eleanor's face remained calm. "I know enough." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. "Turn around," he said. Eleanor frowned. "What?" "You're being detained. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." A few people on the sidewalk stopped walking. A man across the street pulled out his phone. The tension in the air shifted. "For what?" Eleanor asked, still calm. "I'll explain everything at the station," Reynolds said. "Now turn around." Eleanor's heart pounded, but her face remained composed. "You're making a mistake." Reynolds scoffed. I don't think I am." She let out a quiet, tired chuckle. "You really think you know who I am, don't you?" He didn't respond. He just reached for his handcuffs and snapped them onto her wrists. The whispers in the growing crowd got louder. She didn't even do anything. Why is he arresting her? Somebody needs to step in. But no one did. Reynolds led Eleanor toward his patrol car. As he reached for the door handle, his radio crackled. "Unit 5, be advised. Stand by on that 1029. You need to verify the subject's identity immediately." Reynolds frowned. "What do you mean?" "I already ran her ID." A long pause. Then the voice on the other end returned, sharper this time. "Run it again. Right now." Reynolds exhaled impatiently and pulled out his tablet. He scanned her ID again, expecting the same information. The screen loaded. Then everything changed. His smirk disappeared. His grip on the tablet tightened. His whole body went stiff, because right there, in bold letters, was Eleanor Carter's full name. And right beneath it, her son's name, and his title. Reynolds' throat went dry. His stomach twisted into knots. Because Eleanor Carter wasn't just some random woman. She wasn't just anybody. She was the mother of the Attorney General of the United States, the highest law enforcement officer in the country. Reynolds' breathing grew shallow. His chest tightened. His fingers trembled around the edges of the tablet. This was bad, really bad. He slowly looked up at Eleanor. She was watching him, not angry, not scared, just waiting, like she already knew this moment was coming. His heart pounded in his ears. The radio crackled again. "Unit 5, confirm." "Do you need immediate assistance?" Reynolds couldn't speak. His tongue felt heavy in his mouth. He had messed up. Big time. Eleanor shifted slightly in her cuffs. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, she said, "Would you like me to call him?" "Or will you?" Reynolds' stomach dropped. And just like that, his entire world came crashing down. Jake Reynolds stood frozen, gripping his tablet so tightly his fingers ached. His eyes refused to leave the screen, as if staring at it long enough might somehow change what he saw. Eleanor Carter, the woman he had just handcuffed, the woman he had accused of acting suspicious, the woman he had assumed was hiding something. She wasn't just some random elderly lady. She was the mother of the Attorney General of the United States, the highest law officer in the country, and he had just treated her like a criminal. His breath came short. His stomach twisted. His mind raced, grasping for a way out. He slowly looked up. Eleanor stood next to his patrol car, her hands still behind her back. She wasn't scared. She wasn't angry. She was just waiting. Jake's throat went dry. He had arrested the wrong person. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Would you like me to call him? Or will you?" Her words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He wanted to speak, wanted to explain, wanted to say anything to fix this. But what could he say that he didn't know? That it wasn't personal? That he was just doing his job? None of it would matter. His hands moved before his brain caught up. He grabbed his keys, fumbled slightly, and unlocked her cuffs. The metal clicked. The cuffs fell away. But Eleanor didn't move. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't step back. She just stood there, watching him. Jake swallowed hard. "You're free to go," he muttered. Eleanor stayed still. "That's it?" she asked. His jaw clenched. "Yeah, that's it." She raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" His mouth went dry. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor took a slow step forward. Her voice was soft, but carried weight. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds." She paused, letting the moment stretch. "Would you have let me go if my last name wasn't Carter?" Jake felt that question in his chest. His breath hitched. His jaw tightened. His brain wanted to argue, wanted to say, this wasn't about race, or I was just following procedure, or some other excuse to make himself feel better. But he couldn't, because he knew the truth, and so did she, and so did everyone watching. A voice whispered in the crowd. He let her go 'cause of her son. Bet she'd be in the back of his car if she was just another black woman. This is messed up. Jake felt suffocated. He glanced around. The small group of bystanders had grown larger. Phones were still recording. A weight pressed down on his chest. He needed to fix this before it got worse. He needed to say something, anything. What could he even say? Nothing. Nothing make this right. Eleanor sighed, a long, tired sigh. I thought so, she murmured. Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. Then, a voice from behind him. Ma'am, are you okay? Jake barely turned. He already knew. Backup had arrived. Another officer, standing just a few feet away, watching. Eleanor smiled slightly, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was a smile of disappointment. I'm fine, she said, but I think your partner here has something to think about. The second officer's gaze flickered to Jake. Confused, suspicious. Jake couldn't meet his eyes. Eleanor turned toward her car. I think we're done here. She walked slowly, gracefully, not in a rush, not afraid. She got in, shut the door. No slamming, no anger, just quiet disappointment. Jake stood rooted to the ground. Eleanor rolled down her window. Her voice was quiet, controlled. Do me a favor, officer. Jake finally looked at her. His voice was hoarse. What? Think about what you did today. A beat of silence. Then, without another word, she put the car in drive and pulled away. Jake watched her go. His chest felt tight. His pulse pounded. The crowd was still there, still watching. The weight of what he had just done sank in. His radio crackled. Unit 5, confirm status. Jake swallowed hard. His lips parted. But for the first time in his life, he had no words. Jake Reynolds stood there, staring at the road where Eleanor Carter had just driven away. The radio crackled again. Unit 5, confirm status. But he still had no words. His hands were still sweaty, his chest still tight. The people around him were still watching. Some had lowered their phones, shaking their heads as they walked away. Others still whispered. He didn't even apologize. If she wasn't someone important, she'd be in handcuffs right now. Look at him. He knows he messed up. Jake felt every word. He wanted to get in his car and drive away, forget this night ever happened. But he knew that wasn't possible. This wasn't over. His radio buzzed again. This time, it wasn't dispatch. Officer Reynolds, a deep voice said. A voice he instantly recognized. The chief. We need to talk. Now. Jake closed his eyes for a second, then grabbed the radio. Copy. It didn't take long for him to drive back to the station. He barely stepped inside before he was called into the chief's office. The door shut behind him. Sit, the chief said. Jake sat. The chief was an older man, the kind who didn't like long conversations. He folded his hands on the desk, staring at Jake like he was waiting for an explanation. Jake knew better than to say anything first. You arrested Eleanor Carter tonight, the chief finally said. Not a question, a fact. Jake swallowed. Yes, sir. The chief didn't blink. Do you know who her son is? Jake nodded slowly. I do now. The chief leaned back. You made national news in the last 20 minutes. Jake's stomach dropped. You're lucky her son hasn't made a statement yet, the chief continued. You know why? Because she asked him not to. Jake frowned. What? She doesn't want this to become another viral case of police mistreatment, the chief said. She wants you to deal with what you did in a different way. Jake clenched his fists. He was expecting a suspension, maybe even termination. But this was worse. "What does she want me to do?" Jake asked. The chief tossed a folder onto the desk. "You have a meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. with the Attorney General." Jake felt his throat tighten. "You're going to sit in a room with him and listen to exactly how your actions tonight could have gone differently," the chief said. "And you're going to sit there and take it. No arguments, no defenses." Jake swallowed hard. "Understood." The chief sighed, shaking his head. "You got lucky tonight, Reynolds. That woman had every right to destroy your career. And she didn't. Jake knew that. And for the first time, he really thought about why. The next morning, Jake walked into a quiet, dimly lit conference room. Sitting at the far end of the table was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a suit, the Attorney General. Jake had seen him on TV 100 times, but now, sitting across from him, he felt smaller than ever. The Attorney General studied him for a moment. Then he leaned forward. "You arrested my mother last night," he said. Jake's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir. You accused her of being nervous, of hiding something. You assumed she was a threat," he continued. Jake forced himself to hold his gaze. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds," the Attorney General said, "would you have done the same thing if she were a 70-year-old white woman?" Jake's stomach twisted. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say he treated everyone the same. But that would be a lie. The Attorney General let the silence stretch. "That pause tells me everything I need to know." Jake looked down at his hands. "I messed up," he admitted. The Attorney General nodded. "Yes, you did." Jake took a deep breath. "I don't have an excuse. I wasn't thinking." "That's the problem," the Attorney General said. "You weren't thinking. You were assuming. And your assumptions put my mother in handcuffs." Jake's chest felt heavy. "I don't know how to fix it." The Attorney General sighed. "You start by acknowledging the truth, that this isn't about one bad decision. It's about the way you see people, the way your unconscious bias made you treat my mother differently than you would have treated someone else." Jake gritted his teeth. "I don't think I'm racist." "Most people don't," the Attorney General said. "But bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's in the way you assume the worst about a black woman driving a car with a broken taillight." Jake felt exposed. The Attorney General sighed, rubbing his temples. "My mother told me not to push for your firing. She thinks you can learn from this. I hope she's right." Jake's throat felt tight. "I want to be better." The Attorney General studied him for a long moment. Then he slid a piece of paper across the table. Jake looked down at it. A list of programs: community outreach, anti-bias training, meetings with officers who had changed. "Start here," the Attorney General said. "Learn, listen, and next time, don't assume." Jake took the paper. He felt exhausted in a way he never had before. But for the first time, he understood why. Jake Reynolds walked out of that room feeling like a different man. The conversation with the Attorney General wasn't just uncomfortable. It was humbling. For the first time, he had to face the truth about himself. He had never thought of himself as a bad cop. He followed the law. He did his job. He wasn't out to hurt anyone. But that night, on the side of the road, he didn't see Eleanor Carter as just a woman driving home. He saw her as a threat. And that's why he treated her differently. It wasn't something he had meant to do. It wasn't intentional. But that was the problem. Bias wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it looked like a broken taillight turning into an arrest. Jake sat in his car for a long time, staring at the paper the Attorney General had given him. The list of programs, the resources, the next steps. He had two choices. He could ignore it, move on, pretend none of this happened, or he could learn. For the first time in his life, he chose to listen. The next few months weren't easy. He started attending bias training, not because he had to, but because he needed to understand. He sat in rooms with officers who had been on the force longer than him, listening to them talk about the mistakes they had made. He met with black community leaders who told him their stories just like Eleanor's, stories of being pulled over for nothing, of being questioned in their own neighborhoods, of being treated like criminals when they were just living their lives. For the first time, Jake saw the pattern. It wasn't about one bad cop, one mistake, one bad decision. It was about how the whole system had been working this way for so long that no one even questioned it. But now, he questioned it. One evening, after a long shift, Jake found himself parked outside a small house on the east side of town. He wasn't sure if he should be there, but something inside him told him he needed to do this. He walked up to the door and knocked. A few moments later, Eleanor Carter opened the door. For a second, she just looked at him, calm, steady. Jake took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." Eleanor didn't say anything. "I messed up that night," Jake continued. "I saw you, and instead of just treating you like any other person, I assumed the worst. I didn't mean to, but I did." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Jake hesitated, then walked inside. They sat in the small living room. There were pictures on the walls, family photos, her son standing with world leaders, moments of history captured in frames. "You didn't have to come here," Eleanor finally said. "I did," Jake said, "because it wasn't just about that night. It's about everything that led to that moment. And I needed to face that." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And have you?" "I'm trying," Jake said. "I don't think one conversation can fix everything, but I want to do better." Eleanor leaned back in her chair. "Most people in your position don't even get this far," she said. "They make excuses. They defend themselves. They say, 'Not all cops.' But you came here. That means something." Jake looked down. "I don't want to be that kind of officer anymore." Eleanor smiled softly. "Then don't be." They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Eleanor stood up. "You want some coffee?" Jake let out a small laugh. "Yeah, I'd like that." And in that moment, something changed. Not just for Jake, but for both of them. Because change didn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. Jake Reynolds walked out of Eleanor Carter's house that evening, feeling different, lighter, more aware. For the first time, he understood that change doesn't come from ignoring the problem. It comes from facing it. He had spent years thinking he was doing his job the right way. That night, he realized he was part of the problem. Not because he was a bad person, but because he had never questioned the way he saw the world. And if he could change, maybe others could too. This story isn't just about one cop making a mistake. It's about all of us. How often do we assume things about people without knowing them? How often do we let our biases decide how we treat someone? Now, here's the real question. Do you think people like Jake deserve a second chance? Can people truly change? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Because conversations like this, they need to happen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.